You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Well, it's fabulous to be back for another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I'm Paul Garner.
And I'm Todd Wood.
And if you are joining us as a regular, it's great to have you back. If you're new here, do remember to click the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and do spread the word. Tell your friends all about the podcast. All of that is enormously helpful to us. We have a great episode, I think, lined up here. This is a topic that I've been looking forward to talking about. And it's a jam-packed episode, so we're going to kind of leap straight into it. Today, we are going to be talking about a topic that I think many creationists don't talk about very much. And I must confess, it's not a topic that I have tended to give a great deal of thought to. But we're going to be thinking about the Tower of Babel. And immediately, as I say the Tower of Babel...
Yeah.
Something occurs to me, which is a difference in pronunciation.
Right.
Is
Our
it
American
Babel,
listeners,
is it?
Yeah. Is it Babel? Right. Our American listeners
Babel,
know it as
right.
Babel. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, Babel or Babel, and you know, I say tomato, you say tomato.
Right.
Let's call the whole thing off.
Yeah.
And you know, I guess is that difference just a transatlantic difference? Is it just American English versus British English, or is there something sort of more deeper of significance to our differences there?
We were chatting with a student of Hebrew earlier, and he thinks it's Babel, so we're all wrong.
So maybe we're both wrong. We're all wrong. Well, I'm going to stick with Babel because it's what I know, and it's how we tend to pronounce it here.
And I'm going to stick
You will probably say
Babel. Yeah, I'm going to say Babel. Because I'm an American, and that's what we talk about. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, Tower of Babel, that is the topic for today. And it's a huge topic. There's so much to cover. I'm not sure we're going to sort of fit all of this into one episode, so we may come back and revisit it. We'll see. But of course, when we think about the Tower of Babel, we immediately think about the confusion of the languages, of the confusion of human languages. But there's actually a great deal more to the Babel narrative than that. As you look at the Babel account, it seems to be a kind of pivotal event in the biblical narrative with some pretty far-reaching implications, I think. And so we want to sort of explore some of those ideas today. And we thought that perhaps a good place to begin would actually be to read the account itself, because it's quite a short account.
Right.
It's found in Genesis chapter 11, and it runs from verses 1 through to 9. So, it's not many verses.
Right.
And I thought it would be good to, for it to be fresh in our minds and in our listeners' minds. So I'm going to just read those 9 verses. I'm reading from the Authorized King James Version. But if you have a Bible, as you listen to this, you can follow in whatever version you've got in front of you. So Genesis chapter 11, beginning at verse 1. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do. and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. So it's a fascinating account. As I say, it's a very short account.
Yep.
And one of the first things that I think we probably ought to do, Todd, is try to set this account in some kind of context. So what comes before, what comes immediately after, and where does this narrative fall in that overall sort of story of the early history of the earth? Just fill us in a bit on that, please.
Yeah, that's a challenging question. So with creation and the genealogies that are listed in Genesis 5 and 11, you do have a kind of chronological place to put it, right? And with the flood, it's the flood account is very specific about not only when it took place, how old Noah was, but how long Noah was on the ark, right? So there's a time marker when he gets on and a time marker when he gets off. So we know where that goes. Babel is a bit more vague, right? So there's no clear time marker here. So what comes before this is the Table of Nations, which is Genesis chapter 10. It is the story of the sons of Noah and their descendants. It is not like the genealogy that follows the Tower of Babel account, which is much more similar to what you see in Genesis 5, where you have pretty much a straight linear patrilineal line that's given, and then you have ages of the patriarchs when they fathered their child, the son. And so you can add those up and figure out how long is supposed to have taken place. So Genesis 10 is more along the lines of a genealogy where you just have a list of names, and this person descended from this person. So that's a bit different. And then, as I said, immediately following this passage is the Genesis 11 genealogy, which is more specific, more chronological. And then right after that genealogy leads us straight to Abram and the story of Abram, the call of Abram in Genesis 12, and the beginning of the story of Israel. So it fits in there somewhere, right? So you start with the sons of Noah, and they have children, and there's tribes, and then there's this story of the Tower of Babel, and then that leads you into the story of Abraham. And it's a bit, there's a lot of really open questions on exactly how we should figure this into that account and what exactly it means.
Yeah. So we've got Genesis 10, which is this thing that we refer to as the Table of Nations. And that's really tracing the descendants of the three sons of Noah. So we've got Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Right.
And then we have the Babel account. And then we go into this, like you say, this more specific genealogy. So that's kind of the family line of Shem. That comes immediately after the Babel account.
That's right.
And we trace that family line right down to Abram.
Yep.
And then we're into the story of Abram, the call of Abram to leave his home, to go to a land that the Lord is going to show him.
Right.
And in the middle of all of this, we've got these 9 verses about the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
And it strikes me, as I think about that Babel is this really sort of pivotal passage. There's a kind of transition here in the biblical narrative. So up until this point in the Genesis story, we've been dealing with events that are surrounding the whole of humanity. So we've got the creation of the first humans, Adam and Eve, and then we've got the story of their descendants right down to Noah, and then we have the worldwide flood, and the destruction of the whole of that pre-flood humanity, apart from the eight people preserved on the ark. And then we've got the repopulation of the world after the flood by the sons of Noah and their descendants. And here at Babel, we've got the scattering of the people, the confusion of the languages. And then there's a kind of big shift of focus.
Yeah, exactly.
So the big shift of focus is now right down to a particular family, and in fact to a particular man, to a particular person, Abram.
Right.
And we kind of zoom in and we sort of focus then on Abram's story. So Babel sort of marks this point of transition, this shift of focus from the whole of humanity to this one man.
Right.
And so it's a really important passage, I think, for that reason. And of course, we also, in the Table of Nations, which of course we haven't read, but I guess, our listeners can go and read that later.
Sure.
In verse 25 in Genesis chapter 10, we have this sort of intriguing, almost throwaway line about this man called Peleg.
Peleg, yeah.
Who is the son of Eber. He is the brother of Joktan, and we're told that it was in his day that the earth was divided. And of course, that's occasioned an enormous amount of discussion and debate as well. It's this kind of intriguing reference. And I guess we will come back at some point to think about that, to think about exactly what that means and how it relates to Babel, if it relates to Babel at all, because, some people disagree about that. Exactly.
Yeah.
So hopefully all of that just sort of helps to set the scene, for the conversation that we're going to have today. And it leads on, of course, to the crucial question: what does it all mean? That's kind of a summary of what the text tells us. And surprisingly, there's an enormous amount of disagreement about what this means, even among young age creationists, and that itself is quite interesting. We've already mentioned Peleg, and that there's the division of the earth in his days, and that's been understood in a whole variety of different ways. There's even disagreement about whether the events of Babel are something that actually did, happened to the whole of humanity. So are we talking about the totality of Noah's descendants after the flood, or whether it was something that was a local or regional event? Was it something that happened to only a subset of Noah's descendants at some time after the flood? Now, Todd, this whole issue of Babel, I know is something that you have given quite a lot of thought to.
Right.
I guess partly because of your interest in the human fossil record and how that fits into the post-flood context. So what do you think it means? Start to sort of unpack that for us. And, we've already touched a little bit on this issue of chronology. Can we kind of read these chapters, Genesis chapter 10, then Genesis chapter 11, in a kind of rigidly linear chronological fashion, or is there something else going on?
Right. Yeah. So one question is, is Babel happening after Genesis 10, right? The Table of Nations. And then if you read the Table of Nations, you'll see in multiple verses, it refers to the descendants of the sons of Noah according to their tribes and clans and language, right? So Genesis 10 seems to imply, well, doesn't imply, it says there's already languages. There are languages among these different descendants, and so when you get to Genesis 11, if you think that happens after the events of Genesis 10, then this is not a story of the origin of language. It's the story of a particular group of people who are being particularly punished by God. And then, of course, as you mentioned, there are those creationists who also want to make it limited. So if you do think of this in a sort of a chronological fashion where Genesis 10 happens and then Genesis 11 happens, then you're probably prone to think this must be just some of the descendants, right? This must be people who lived, wherever, and maybe they're the Semitic descendants of Noah, the family of Shem, and so that's what this story is about. I think that's not right. I tend to think that the division of Peleg is the Tower of Babel. I think that those 9 verses of chapter 11 are a bit of a rewind, if you will, to fill us in on what happened, that these descendants of Noah should end up speaking different languages like that. I see this happening kind of frequently in Scripture. We in the West tend to have a much more, I think, linear and ordered view of the way that written works should tell stories, but I don't see that well in the Hebrew Old Testament. So what I see there is, for example, Genesis 2 rewinds to tell us the story of things that are happening on the 6th day of creation, with the creation of Adam and Eve and the planting of the garden. I see another really great example would be in Genesis 6. In fact, throughout the flood narrative, you have a number of places where the story just pauses and then tells you what it just told you in other words, right? So it's sort of filling in some more detail that you didn't get the first time. The first place this happens, you go read Genesis 6, 1 through 8. It's talking about the condition of the world before the flood and how the sons of God saw the daughters of men and they took wives, and then there were the Nephilim in the earth, and God says, every thought of man's heart is only evil continually. I will destroy them in a flood. And that ends with Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And then immediately after that, you have, it seems to rewind. God calls Noah and tells him what he's going to do. Look, Noah, everybody is really wicked and I don't like it and I'm unhappy with it, so I'm going to destroy the world in a flood. So you get this complete repetition of what you just read. And then God says, oh yeah, and then I want you to build an ark. And then it builds on that. So I tend to look at the way the Bible tells stories like that as I don't have to think that these sort of little detached narratives have to be read in a perfectly sequential fashion, that this one happens after that one, after that one, after that one. There's a sort of broad agreement, but in the case of Genesis 10, I do think the Babel story is rewinding to tell us what happened, and that the division of the earth in the days of Peleg is in fact the Tower of Babel. And that means I tend to think when it says the whole earth was of one language and all the people went to Shinar to build this tower in this city, that really does probably mean everybody. That there may have, whether there were stragglers off living on their own, hermits and antisocial people, I'm not real sure. But the vast majority of people were living in Babel and building that tower and building that city.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So in effect, we've got these kind of, if you like, flashbacks or recaps, a bit like in a TV drama where, you kind of tell the story and then occasionally you get these kind of flashbacks that then fill in some details that you perhaps weren't told the first time round.
Right.
And the Bible authors, that they're often doing similar things. So that's very helpful. And of course that, like you say, it does help to determine exactly how we read and understand exactly what's going on here. So let's perhaps just try and dig into that then just a little bit more. So
Okay.
when we read this account, so you say that this probably does, include the whole of humanity. Is this the origin of human ethnic and cultural diversity? Do we trace all of that back to Babel? Is this the origin of all of the different languages? How far can we go with this, Todd?
Yeah, and that is, in my book, kind of the open question, right? How does it relate to the origin of people around the world? How does it relate to what we see in the archaeological record? How does it relate to what we know about languages? I'd say sort of a first approximation here. I don't see in this passage an origin of every language on the planet, right?
Right.
So I don't think there was some tribe coming out of Babel that spoke English, because we know. Yeah. I mean, and this isn't even controversial. We just have. You can pick up the 1611 King James. You can pick up the 1540 Geneva Bible. You can get a copy of Wycliffe's translation from much earlier, and you can see how the English language has changed. And then people who actually study English and linguistics can tell you about the various places that English has changed significantly from its original sort of Germanic origin as sort of a offshoot of German, or a cousin of modern German. Let's call it that. So I have no problem with the idea that languages are constantly changing, that Babel and its confusion may have produced certain what we might think of as proto-languages, forerunners of modern language, but not in any sense the languages that we have today. So there wasn't anybody there speaking Swahili or Arabic or anything like that. This was these were older languages. So that would be my first.
So Babel is not the origin of French and Spanish and German, but it might be the origin of perhaps the broader language families within which those specific languages have subsequently arisen. Is that kind of the picture that you think we're given?
I think that's as best as we can guess, right? So what we know. So here's a few things that we know. We know, for example, that they were confused. The people were confused, and they were scattered. Now, there's some question, I think, in my mind. Is this two different things happening or just one, right? So is it a confusion and a scattering, or is it a scattering because of a confusion? Now, another thing that linguistics has taught us is that when people of different languages get together and want to carry on business together, the language differences don't stop them. They generally will form what's called a pidgin, which is a very small vocabulary, a couple hundred words, where these are used to carry on commerce. Whatever business is that you want to carry on with some people, you can create this pidgin. And so you can have your own language that you learn in your among your people, and then you have this pidgin that you talk. So in that respect, I think the Tower of Babel story is kind of surprising a little bit to me, because if they really were committed to building this city and this tower, why didn't they just carry on in spite of their language confusion? So I tend to think there's got to be more to this story than what we're told here. So that's sort of the first approximation of what we have there in Genesis 11.
Yeah.
Fast forward, for example, to the time of Joseph, right? Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt. Joseph is now whatever vice pharaoh, whatever position it was he had, and prime minister of Pharaoh's court or whatever, and he is able to speak Egyptian with his Egyptian friends, and the brothers cannot understand him. So by that point, at the very least, Egyptian is sufficiently different from that Canaanite or Hebrew language they were speaking, that they can't really understand it anymore, and they need a translator. So those are sort of some, and I'm waving my hands because it's a lot of hand waving. We have these little snippets of the text that tell us a little bit about what's going on, and we have this event of confusion, and then eventually you have this indication that indeed there is a different language in Egypt than there is in Canaan and Aramean descendants and so forth.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and what's becoming clear to me as we have this conversation is how many unknowns there are.
Yeah.
And how much potential there is as well for creationist scholars to do more work in this area, and to dig into some of these questions and see whether we can help to resolve some of them. So, yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I wanted to rewind just briefly
Sure.
here, because we're talking about the whole of humanity being of one language, one speech at the time of Babel. What do you think was the situation before the flood? I mean, we're dealing here with the situation after the flood, where these people are descended from Noah and his 3 sons, from essentially one family. So you can kind of understand that they're all speaking the same language. What was the situation before the flood? Was there language diversity before the flood? Was everybody speaking exactly the same language for that whole pre-flood period? What do you think about that?
It's a good question. So I know that if we look at the numbers in the Hebrew text of the scripture, we add them up, you get 1,600 years from 1,656 years, I think it is, between Adam's creation and the day that Noah stepped on the ark. 1,600 plus or minus 6 months, whatever it is. So that's a long time. If you look at the history of modern language, for example, you will notice that time period we went from, continental Europe at least, went from speaking Latin, 400 AD, Latin was still a living language. People were still using it and learning it, to speaking the big 5, right? The 5 Romance languages, Romanian and Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And those are all fairly different languages. There's a lot of overlap, but they're distinct languages. No one, I think, today would ever question that. So there is room there for a lot of language diversity to happen before the flood. And did they have different languages? I guess it would depend on how widespread they got, right? I think it is in the localization of people, right, where they are widely separated and there's not a lot of people moving back and forth. There are people moving back and forth, right, to carry on trade and whatever, but there's not a lot of people doing that. Most people are staying where they are. That's where those individual differences come into play. Babel being a great example. We're not even 250 years old. America, United States. We've been over here in the colonies since probably the 1600s. Early 1600s. So you're looking at 400 years separation of our language. and we already have differences, right? and it's fascinating to me. You come over to America for one of the first times, and there's on the menu biscuits and gravy.
Yeah.
Which,
yeah, that means something very different here.
so could they have spoken different languages back then? I suppose it's possible if there were enough of them and they had spread out and become separated. Then yeah, I suppose it's possible that that there were different languages before the flood.
You've been listening to Todd and Paul Talk Creation. If you'd like more information on sponsorship opportunities, or maybe you'd like to have a product or book reviewed or discussed on our podcast, please contact us at podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. If you would like more information about what we discussed today, be sure to check out our show notes at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast.
You've mentioned their kind of geographical separation and the role that it might play in, generating language diversity. I suppose the other factor that we have to take into account, particularly when we're thinking about that pre-flood world, is the longevity of the people. Because, you also have a lot of continuity between generations. So I think if you look at the genealogical information, Adam and Eve's son Seth, his lifespan actually overlaps with the lifespan of Noah.
Right.
So again, perhaps that would have the opposite effect of perhaps promoting stability in languages because of that enormous overlap in terms of lifespans. But
sure, yeah,
that's a fascinating discussion. But whatever happened in that pre-flood world. Even if there was language diversity, it looks as if after the flood there was essentially language uniformity,
right?
Because the whole of the human population was reduced to essentially one family on the ark.
That's right.
So that seems to be the situation that we have then in the immediate post-flood world. The other topic that I just sort of wanted to talk to you about, and this one gets us into some very controversial sort of territory potentially. But it's to do with ethnic diversity and there are all kinds and have been all kinds of, well, often quite disturbing interpretations of what's going on in Genesis chapter 9.
Yes.
And the passage concerning the curse on Canaan.
Right.
Do you want to just talk to us a bit about some of that? I mean, first of all, perhaps you should just tell us what the narrative in Genesis 9 is.
Right. Yeah. So the story there is fairly simple. Noah plants a vineyard. He makes wine. He gets drunk, passes out in his tent. He's naked. And apparently his grandson, Canaan, son of Ham, comes along, finds him, and it's not exactly clear what's going on. He goes and tells some people, and I get the sense that this was a disrespectful thing rather than trying to deal with it. And so you have the other brothers back their way in with a blanket and cover up Noah so they don't see him. Noah wakes.
There's some kind of subtext going on there that is perhaps quite hard for us moderns to kind of fully understand.
Yes.
There's something going on there with what Canaan does.
Yes, it's something that's,
like you say, is disrespectful in some way.
It's not written out for us that he made fun of him or he should have done something that he didn't do or something like that. And so when Noah wakes up, he's angry and he curses Ham and Canaan and says that they will be servants, slaves of their brothers, the brothers. And so, when you come to the sort of medieval ideas about humanity, you have a lot of, basically, people think in terms of nations and tribes, right? So you have a recognition of a lot of diversity, and there you go. And it's not especially horrifying. It isn't really until Europeans start enslaving Africans that discussion of ethnic diversity and differences becomes perhaps more sinister and overtly racist. There's probably racism. I would think humans are always distrustful of other people, right? And we always think our group is better than everybody else. So there's always going to be that subtext. But once there's sort of this systematic enslavement of Africans, essentially everything that follows, the birth of anthropology as a science, is essentially racist, and horrifically so. So that when you read 19th century anthropology, it's appealing to Genesis in various ways to describe why Black Africans ought to be enslaved and mistreated and treated like animals, essentially. So the curse on Canaan is probably the most common of those things, where they would say the curse is manifested in the black skin. And so if someone's black, they deserve to be enslaved. And it's sickening when you have to sort of sort through this, because you're reading stuff that, as a creationist, I'm thinking, this is really interesting. They're talking about all these cultures and how they're related to modern cultures. And then you get to Ham and Canaan and this slavery apologetics, and it suddenly takes this horrific, awful turn for just the absolute worst. And so it's a mess. It's a mess. So when you think today, when I'm trying to think about the diversity of ethnic groups in the modern world and where they might come from and how they might relate to what we read in Genesis 11, I feel very wary and very cautious about any of this because of its ugly and tainted past, the way that the Bible has been misused to justify some really wicked, ongoing, centuries-long behavior.
Yeah. So that's a kind of salutary caution that we kind of need to tread carefully here where we deal with these kinds of topics. But I think it ultimately is. It does seem to be the case that something of ethnic and cultural diversity is one of the consequences of the Babel event. We're not quite sure, exactly how that worked out, how that played out, but some have speculated that actually this confusion of languages is not simply a confusion of words. You can translate words, right? So, but it's also to do with viewpoints, ways of thinking, and that's often very tied up with language.
Yes.
Your kind of perspective, your outlook.
Yes.
And perhaps this, helps to explain what seems to be this sudden emergence of often quite diverse cultures in terms of art and technology and worship and all kinds of things that often these civilizations that then emerge in the sort of aftermath of the Babel event almost appear to be sort of fully fledged cultures that have arisen, and that may have a lot to do with this cultural outlook, this sort of perspective that goes along with the confusion of the languages.
Yeah, I think so.
So that's very interesting. Maybe that's a further discussion that we can unpack that another time. But I also wonder now whether we could start to sort of perhaps get into some of the details about Babel itself. And there are some specific questions that people often want to know the answer to. One of which is, where was Babel? Can we identify a particular location on the surface of the earth and say that's where Babel took place?
Yeah.
And another big question is, when did it take place? We've already kind of hinted that it took place in the days of Peleg, but when was that? And can we kind of pin that down a bit more? So perhaps let's begin with the question of location. Perhaps you could just start to unpack that a bit more for us.
Yeah.
Is there something that we can say sensibly about that?
Yeah. So when you read the text itself, it does give you a pretty clear indication of where it is. It is in the plain, a plain in the land of Shinar, and it is a place called Babel. And people have accepted for a long time, this goes back way far, that this is referring to the ancient city of Babylon. Do you say Babylon?
No, Babylon.
Okay. Yeah. The ancient city of Babylon. It's pretty clear those words are very specific in the Old Testament, so it's really not a question, I think, among Bible scholars about where this should be placed. So, yeah. It appears to be Babylon, and I don't really have any good reason to argue against that. The only thing that concerns me and that I wonder about, Paul, can you read? You have the authorized version there still?
I do.
Handy?
Yeah.
Can you read just verse 2?
Yep. Genesis 11 and verse 2 says, "And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there."
Okay. Yeah, that's exactly what I have. I've got the English Standard Version here on my phone, and it says they migrated from the east. Okay. Now, if that's the case, right, we are looking for people being in someplace farther east of Babylon, right? And if that's the case, you are now getting into the Zagros Mountains, what is now the land of Iran. And if you were to look for the mountains of Ararat, where the ark is said to have landed, that is in the ancient kingdom of Urartu, which is north. I've tried, if you draw the whole boundaries of the land of the kingdom of Urartu, you cannot really get them east of Babylon. It is north of Babylon. It is straight up north. So, yeah, I think that raises some interesting geographic questions. So there's people, I've seen scholars argue that maybe the preposition from the east could be understood in terms of the perspective of the author of the text, who is in, say, Sinai or the much farther western ancient Near East, so that Ararat and Babylon are both in the east, right? So they are migrating from the east because it's all east. That's an interesting idea. But yeah, that's a bit of a puzzle. I don't know exactly how to resolve that right now, because it would seem that the ark, the landing place of the ark and where the people were getting off the ark, was farther to the north than Babylon.
Yeah. Is it, I don't know the Hebrew language at all. Is there any ambiguity in Hebrew prepositions? Do we clearly know that
And
this is from the east and not to the east or in the east.
I
don't know.
I don't know, and that would be a question we could ask a Bible scholar if we could get him on here. But from what I have read, there are people who say that there's a bit of ambiguity in that preposition, that it could be in the east they were migrating. But I've heard other people just sort of shrug that off and say, no, it's from the east. That's what it says. That's what that word means. So yeah, it's a good question.
So some other kind of related questions, just to sort of dig into this a little bit more. I suppose the most radical idea that I have in the back of my head is, could the consensus be wrong in identifying Babel with Babylon, and the land of Shinar with Mesopotamia? To what extent is that, or are those identifications embedded in a particular reconstruction of Earth history? And to what extent might we as creationists want to even go back to basics and rethink that? You said you don't really have any good reason to question it, but is it something that we should keep on the table?
We can always keep things on the table, and I think it's always healthy to be asking questions of the scripture to make sure that we understand it and to make sure that we are not misinterpreting. So yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask those big scary questions from time to time. But when I look into the history of interpretation, so this is one of the ways that I like to examine how texts have been understood. The idea that this is Babylon is very old in the church, and even in Hebrew. I think even Josephus understands this to be Babylon. I don't find a lot of wiggle room there. With such a long-standing, unanimous understanding of what this is supposed to represent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tradition is not always right.
No, that's right.
Quite often there's a very good reason why it's a tradition.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
So we have to kind of think carefully about that. The other question, going back even further, is the question of where was Ararat? Where was the landing place of the ark?
Yes.
And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that. My understanding is that we basically don't know for certain. The biblical text itself is somewhat unspecific because it doesn't talk about a particular mountain peak. It talks about the mountains of Ararat, which seems to specify more of a region.
Yes.
And the traditional landing site of the ark, which is a peak in eastern Turkey, is actually, at least from a creationist perspective, it's a post-flood mountain. It's a volcanic mountain that probably didn't exist at the time of the flood or at the end of the flood. And so that, I think, makes that identification problematic. And I think I'm right in saying that it's actually only been known as the biblical Ararat in relatively recent times. I think the tradition of calling it Ararat goes back to about the 12th century or something like that. But
if that's recent to you, then yes, I agree.
Well, recent in the sense that it doesn't go right back to the closer to the time of the flood itself.
Sure.
It is a relatively modern identification, and of course, if you read the literature, there have been a range of different possible identifications of Ararat that have been proposed and discussed. So there is some ambiguity, I think, about exactly where we think Ararat was. Right. And then, of course, the other question is, we're assuming that perhaps the people didn't migrate too much, didn't move around between the time of the end of the flood and the Babel event.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Do we know that? Maybe they did move around quite substantially before this Babel event happens, and they journey from the east.
Maybe it's a little fuzzy, right? So, verse 1 says, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words." And then verse 2, "And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there." So, are the people the whole earth, or are they just some people? And yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
I tend to think if this is the genesis of language, if you will, that's probably going to be most of the people there. Most of the people in existence at the time were at Babel. But I think it's sufficiently non-specific that could be open to question, that you could have some people who have decided, I'm just going to go live in the mountains by myself and forget you people.
Yeah.
Something like that. I'm 400 years old now, and I'm tired of living with people, so I'm going to go in the mountains. And I get it, really.
Yeah. Now, another sort of related question to this question of, the identification of Babel with Babylon is this idea, which is a very, common one, that the Tower of Babel was something called a ziggurat.
Yes.
And I wonder if we could just talk about that for a bit. If you open any kind of Bible dictionary or Bible encyclopedia and you read about the Tower of Babel, you will read about Babylonian Ziggurats.
Yep.
And you'll often see these images of Ziggurats. Just for the benefit of our listeners who may not know, a ziggurat is kind of a large pyramid, roughly pyramid-shaped structure, usually terraced, usually has kind of steps to it.
So it looks kind of squarish or sort of cubish.
Yeah, kind of squarish.
It's not like a pyramid in Egypt. It's got those terraces on it. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of stepped, and there are some surviving examples or partial examples in places like Baghdad and and other places. And it's thought that they were basically centers of cultic worship. They were temples. There'd be a priestly class that perhaps would go, the gods were thought to dwell at the top of these structures, and maybe sacrifices would be made, devotions would be made to the gods. So that's kind of what a ziggurat is or was. Do you think that the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat? And maybe even more specifically, can we point to a particular ziggurat and say that's the Tower of Babel?
I don't know. I tend to say that any of the ziggurats that are surviving in ruins today are probably too young for being the Tower of Babel. Certainly the ziggurat at Babylon. Here's a little bit of interesting history for you. The ziggurat of Babylon was in ruins during the period of the kings of Judah. And Nebuchadnezzar, one of the things that he did, and this is sort of a little bit reflected in what the Bible has to say, but Nebuchadnezzar is known as a great builder. So when Nebuchadnezzar comes along and conquers a bunch of nations and a bunch of city-states and makes Babylon his capital, one of the building projects he initiated was to rebuild the Ziggurat of Babylon. And it takes decades, but it is finished. And there is a record. It's called the Tower of Babel Stele. It is in a private collection, but it's an ancient depiction of what the Ziggurat of Babylon would have looked like. And of course, if we're thinking in creationist terms and putting the Tower of Babel at the sort of dawn of the nations, right after Noah, Nebuchadnezzar's way too late. This is not the Tower of Babel. But what's interesting to me about the Tower of Babel Stele is that Nebuchadnezzar is writing, it's basically written in his voice, right? And he's bragging about how he built this tower. He's bragging about how he raised its top to heaven. He's bragging about how he brought all these people from the far earth, for all these nations and tribes, together to Babylon to build this tower, right? So there's this really interesting, I think, parallel, if you will, with the way the Bible describes the Tower of Babel. And so, your modern critical scholar reads that, and he's arguing, or she's arguing, that the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis is written as a satire of Nebuchadnezzar's ziggurat that he was building. And so the reason that you have this parallel is because the author of Genesis is mocking Nebuchadnezzar, which strikes me as a really weird way of doing it, because anybody could go to Babylon and see the ziggurat and they would know, oh, well, there's the Tower of Babel. This is not, it is, what's described in that text is literally the opposite of what happened, right? So to me, then, I think it makes more sense that Nebuchadnezzar this is part of his arrogance and part of his bragging, right? And we see that in Daniel when he is humbled and turned into driven mad for a period of time, because he is bragging about how he has done all these things. And so here's this record of this extra biblical record of Nebuchadnezzar bragging about building this tower. And I think the subtext and the subtext is that he has brought the captives to Babylon. This rebuilding of the ziggurat is happening during the captivity. He's brought the captives there. They brought with them their scrolls. He knows, he is familiar with what's in those scrolls. So he is bragging about what he has accomplished that Yahweh, the God of Israel, has tried to prevent. That he brought the people back from their scattered locations. He made them build and commence building this tower, and he finished it, and he raised its top to heaven in ways that the Genesis story indicates that God prevented from happening. So is it a ziggurat? Is it the ziggurat of Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar built? No, I don't think so. I think Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's rebuilding the ruined Tower of Babel. So I think that's what's going on there. Yeah. So I don't know that it's a ziggurat. If it is a ziggurat, it's definitely the very first one ever. So
yeah. And I think what you say there about Nebuchadnezzar's ziggurat, that kind of makes a lot of sense to me, that he's kind of riffing off the accounts that he already knows that the Hebrews have and sort of bragging about it. And of course, from a higher critical perspective, they can kind of go with their particular kind of spin on it, because they think that the book of Genesis was written sometime around the time of the Babylonian captivity or just after the return to the land. And of course, from a traditional perspective, that's just way too late. I mean, Moses couldn't possibly be the author or compiler of Genesis in that case. So that it's problematic, I think, at lots of different levels from a more sort of conservative perspective. But I think what you said there makes a great deal of sense. Now, Todd, time is kind of running out for this episode, and there are lots of other things that I would like to talk about. I'd like to talk more about the dating, particularly of the Tower of Babel. I'd like to talk about its relationship to for example, human fossils, the human fossil record and the archaeological record. And we could talk some more about language development and exactly also what happened at Babel. What was the nature of the confusion of the languages? And I mean, there's a whole host of other questions I have lined up here. But I think what we'll do is, for now, we'll kind of break there.
Okay.
And I would like us to come back and talk some more about this because, as I say, this is not a topic that I've given a lot of consideration to, and I'm finding this just as fascinating as I'm sure our listeners are as well. So we will come back to this topic at some point, so stay tuned for that. Okay, Todd, what have we got coming up next episode? Well, we don't quite know, do we? Because we're not absolutely certain what order these episodes are going to go out in. So let's kind of leave our listeners hanging there. You're going to have to come back and find out what's next. It might be part 2 of Babel. It might be something else. So we'll see. Do remember that you can find out all the details about the podcast at our webpage, which is coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast, along with show notes for all of our episodes. Keep your questions and comments coming in. We love to hear from our viewers and listeners. You can email us at podcast@coresci.org. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you get notified of future content. Like and share our episodes, tell your friends. If you're listening to this on a traditional podcast streaming platform, leave us a positive review. That's very much welcomed. And of course, if you're enjoying the podcast, as we always do, we'll end our episode by telling you how you can donate to us so that we can keep this content coming. If you would like to give to the work of Biblical Creation Trust, then you can go to our website at biblicalcreationtrust.org. On the homepage, there's a donate button which you can click on, and it takes you to a giving page, and all of the options for giving are listed there. Including direct bank transfers and online giving and PayPal if you're outside of the UK. And Todd, for Core Academy of Science, how do people give to Core Academy?
So you can give to Core Academy. You can find us on the web at coresci.org/connect. There'll be links to all of our social media where you can follow us there, and you can also find a link there to support us. You could also go directly to coresci.org/donate, where you'll find, as Paul said, information about how to donate online or send us a check, or, if you see me in church, slip me some cash. That's fine. I'll do that. I'll take that too.
Okay, that's great. Well, that's it for this time, and we'll see you in a fortnight's time. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.